In the world of the underground, the deadliest blade isn't made of steel. It is forged from the trust of the person sleeping beside you. In a room guarded by 100 guns, the most lethal weapon isn't a bullet, it is the silence between a question and a lie. If Hyuk Jang allowed the tip of his gold pen to touch that paper, his empire would be dismantled before the candles on the table burned out. He was a king about to sign his own death warrant, and only the woman in the white service apron saw the trap being laid. The air in the private lounge was heavy with a cold, expensive tension. Perched high above the neon pulse of the Seoul skyline, what looked like a historic peace treaty was actually a meticulously choreographed execution. At the center of the dark table sat Hyuk Jang, a man who commanded the room through sheer gravity. His black shirt was unbuttoned just enough to reveal the ink of a chest tattoo, a mark of a history written in blood. To his left, his wife was a vision of lethal elegance. Dressed in a bold red suit that looked like a splash of blood against the clinical luxury of the room, she acted as the bridge between Hyuk and the rivals across the table. Her voice was steady and melodic, providing a translation that sounded like a victory but tasted like ash. Faith Williams moved through the shadows of the room like a ghost. To the powerful men at the table, she was just the help, a waitress whose only purpose was to ensure the glasses stayed full. But Faith was no ordinary server. She was an Interpol ghost, a former negotiation specialist who had spent years learning how to hear the truth hidden behind a liar's grammar. As she listened to the wife's translation, the deception hit her with the force of a physical blow. The woman in red wasn't brokering peace. She was leading Hyuk into a slaughter. Faith's hand trembled slightly as she gripped her serving tray. She had spent months hiding her identity to stay alive, but watching a man sign away his life was a crime her conscience wouldn't allow. As Hyuk lowered the pen toward the dotted line, Faith stepped out of the shadows and leaned into the space where the truth was being murdered. The Japanese delegate across the table offered a tight, expectant nod as he slid the final page of the contract forward. Beside Hyuk Jang, his wife, resplendent in a blood-red suit that looked like a splash of violence against the room's clinical luxury, adjusted her sleeves with a calm, predatory grace. She had just finished summarizing the final clause, her voice a soothing melody of mutual cooperation and shared prosperity. To Hyuk, it sounded like the end of a long, bloody war. To the men across the table, it was the sound of a trap snapping shut. Faith Williams felt the tray in her hand become impossibly heavy. She was supposed to be a shadow, a non-entity in a white service apron whose only job was to refresh the mineral water. But her ears, trained by years of Interpol tactical linguistics, were ringing with the dissonance of the wife's lies. The woman in red hadn't said joint venture. She had used a specific, archaic dialect term for total liquidation of leadership. If Hyuk Jang signed that paper, his men would be executed by dawn, and his wife would be the one holding the smoking gun. Faith took a breath that felt like ice in her lungs. She knew the rules of her new, quiet life. Stay invisible. Keep serving. Don't look back. But the Interpol agent buried beneath the waitress's uniform screamed at the injustice. She stepped forward, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Every step felt like walking through thick mud, a slow-motion descent back into a world of danger she had tried so hard to leave behind. She reached for the crystal glass near Hyuk's elbow, pretending to spot a water ring that didn't exist. The wife's eyes, sharp and calculating, narrowed slightly, tracking the waitress's movement with a flicker of sudden, cold suspicion. Faith ignored the heat of that gaze. She leaned in close, her body tensing with the absolute risk of what she was about to do. Positioning herself right next to the Mafia Boss's ear, Faith shielded her mouth from the rest of the table. Her voice was a ghost of a sound, a whisper barely carrying through the quiet air of the penthouse. "She's not signing a treaty, Mr. Jang. She's signing your death," Faith whispered. "She just surrendered your shipping routes to the cartel." Hyuk's hand, poised with the heavy gold pen, didn't tremble. It simply froze midair. The tip of the pen hovered a mere millimeter above the dotted line, the exact point where his legacy ended and his execution began. A dangerous, silent storm brewed behind his dark eyes as he slowly, very slowly, turned his head to look at the woman in the white apron. The center of gravity in the room had shifted, and for the first time in his life, the most powerful man in Seoul felt the cold touch of a truth he had been too blind to see. The silence in the lounge didn't just grow, it solidified, becoming a physical weight that pressed against the chests of everyone at the table. Hyuk Jang remained motionless, his eyes wide and fixed on a point somewhere beyond the paper, as if he were watching his entire world crumble in real time. The shock wasn't a loud explosion, it was a quiet, cold realization that seeped into his marrow. For years, he had been the center of gravity, the man who anticipated every move, yet he had missed the viper coiled in his own bed. Across from him, the Japanese delegates shifted in their seats, their expressions tightening into masks of professional impatience. His wife, the woman in the bold red suit, tilted her head slightly. Her complexion remained flawless, her posture elegant, but there was a new, microscopic focus in her eyes as they darted between Hyuk and the waitress who had lingered a second too long. "Hyuk," she asked, her voice a soft, melodic chime that had once been his sanctuary. "The delegates are waiting. Is there a problem with the logistics clause?" Hyuk didn't look at her yet. He looked at the gold pen in his hand, a gift from her on their 3rd anniversary. He felt the weight of it, the cold metal against his palm. Faith's whisper echoed in his mind, a sharp contrast to the lullaby of his wife's deceit. He needed to be sure. He needed to know if the woman he loved was truly the architect of his ruin. Slowly, Hyuk turned his gaze toward his wife. He saw the way her lips were slightly tight, the way she wasn't breathing quite as deeply as she had been moments ago. He pointed a steady finger at a paragraph near the bottom of the page, the one she had just described as a security guarantee for their Busan docks. "This section here," Hyuk said, his voice gravelly and dangerous. "Translated again, precisely. I want to hear the exact wording regarding the transfer of oversight." The wife didn't blink, but her fingers curled slightly into the fabric of her red skirt. "It says what I told you, Hyuk. It guarantees our men will remain in control of the perimeter while the merger finalized." "Why do you ask?" Faith, standing just outside the immediate circle of power, saw the trap close. She knew that paragraph didn't mention perimeters or guarantees. It was a formal declaration of asset forfeiture. Hyuk watched his wife's face, searching for a tremor, a flicker of guilt. She stared back with a mask of perfect, practiced loyalty. It was the ultimate betrayal. She wasn't just lying, she was comfortable doing it. In one sudden, violent motion, Hyuk's hand closed into a fist around the gold pen. The muscles in his forearm corded, and with a sharp, sickening crack, the expensive instrument snapped in two. Dark, blue-black ink bled across his palm and splattered onto the white tablecloth, blooming like a Rorschach blot of his shattered trust. The wife flinched, her composure finally fracturing. Her eyes widened, her breath hitching in a way that no amount of training could hide. That single, reflexive jump was her confession. The center of gravity had truly shifted. Hyuk dropped the broken pieces of the pen onto the contract, the ink staining the very lines she had lied about. He looked at her not as a husband, but as a judge, his eyes burning with a shock that had transitioned into a terrifying, silent rage. The king had realized the crown was a noose, and the woman in red was the one holding the rope. The blue-black ink continued to spread across the white linen, a dark stain that seemed to swallow the light in the room. Hyuk Jang didn't look at his wife's trembling hands or the stone-faced delegates across from him. His focus was entirely on the woman in the white apron. She stood perfectly still, her posture possessing a rhythmic, disciplined balance that no standard service training could instill. She didn't look like a waitress waiting for a tip. She looked like a soldier waiting for the perimeter to break. Without taking his eyes off Faith, Hyuk reached into the pocket of his black shirt and pulled out a slim, customized smartphone. With a sharp flick of his thumb, he activated a proprietary facial recognition suite used by the syndicate's top-tier intelligence wing. He didn't need a name, he needed a history. He tilted the screen, capturing a high-resolution scan of Faith's face as she stood under the glow of the lounge's recessed lighting. The device hummed, a soft vibration against his ink-stained palm. In less than 3 seconds, the screen flickered red, then bypassed the standard civilian databases entirely. It dove deep into encrypted government servers, slicing through layers of firewalls that usually took hours to penetrate. When the result finally populated, it wasn't a resume or a social media profile. It was a classified dossier marked with the silver seal of Interpol. His eyes scanned the digital file, widening slightly as the truth unspoolled. Faith Williams, former lead negotiations specialist, Tactical Linguistics Division. The report was littered with classified stamps and a final, chilling designation: status, burned. Location, unknown. She was a ghost, a high-level operative who had vanished from the grid after a deep-cover mission went south in Marseille. She wasn't a waitress hiding from a bad past. She was a tactical weapon hiding from a global manhunt. A grim, appreciative smile tugged at the corner of Hyuk's mouth. He looked up from the screen, his gaze locking onto Faith's with a newfound intensity. He saw the flicker of recognition in her eyes. She knew exactly what he had just found. The status paradox had shifted again. The invisible woman was no longer a servant, and the woman in the red suit was no longer a queen. "You're a long way from The Hague, Miss Williams," Hyuk said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble that ignored his wife's frantic attempts to regain control of the conversation. The wife's head snapped toward Faith, her panic turning into a sharp, jagged edge of desperation. "Hyuk, she's a nobody. A waitress. You're listening to a servant over me." Hyuk ignored her, standing up slowly. The chair scraped against the floor like a blade. He leaned over the table, his ink-stained hands flat on the ruined contract. "She isn't a servant, Seo Yen. She's the only person in this room who isn't a goddamn amateur." He looked at Faith, the shock in his eyes replaced by a calculated, lethal clarity. "If what you said is true, then the men outside that door aren't my guards anymore." "Who are they, Faith?" Faith didn't hesitate. The waitress mask dropped completely, revealing the cold, analytical mind of a woman who had survived the world's darkest corners. "They're a cleanup crew, Mr. Jang. And if we don't move in the next 60 seconds, this lounge becomes a tomb." The transition from the plush dining room to the industrial cold of the kitchen was a blur of silver and white. Faith didn't wait for Hyuk's command. She knew the rhythm of an ambush better than she knew the menu she'd been serving for months. As the heavy swinging doors clicked shut behind her, the silence of the corridor was replaced by the low hum of industrial refrigerators and the sharp, metallic scent of ozone. She wasn't alone. Standing by the prep station was a man who didn't belong to the kitchen staff. He was dressed in the nondescript black of a security detail, but his posture was all wrong, too balanced, too focused. He held a silenced semi-automatic, the muzzle already tracking the movement of the door. The wife hadn't just lied at the table, she had sanitized the exit routes. Faith didn't scream. Screaming was for victims, and she had spent too long pretending to be one. As the hitman squeezed the trigger, Faith dropped, her athletic frame coiled like a spring. The muffled thwip of the suppressed round shattered a stack of porcelain plates behind her, raining ceramic shards like white confetti. She reached upward, her fingers closing around the handle of a heavy copper sauté pan still warm from the range. In one fluid, explosive motion, she swung it. The metal connected with the assassin's wrist with a sickening crack, sending his weapon skittering across the slick tile floor. The hitman snarled, lunging for a ceramic chef's knife from the magnetic rack. Faith didn't give him the space. She utilized the narrow environment of the kitchen as an extension of her own body. She kicked a rolling metal cart into his shins, throwing him off balance, and then closed the distance. Her Interpol training took over, the kind of close-quarters combat designed to neutralize threats in seconds without the luxury of a firearm. She grabbed a heavy industrial meat fork from the counter, using the long tines not to stab, but to hook the man's sleeve, redirecting his momentum into the edge of a stainless steel prep table. He gasped as his ribs met the hard metal, but he was a professional. He swung a heavy fist that grazed Faith's jaw, sending a flash of white through her vision. Faith spat blood, her eyes narrowing with a lethal, focused heat. She grabbed a pressurized canister of culinary torch fuel and a long-handled lighter. With a practiced flick, she created a brief, roaring jet of flame that forced the assassin back, his eyebrows singeing as he recoiled in instinctive terror. Before he could recover, she gripped a heavy marble rolling pin and delivered a precise, downward strike to his temple. The hitman collapsed, his head hitting the floor with a heavy, final thud. Faith stood over him, her chest heaving, her white apron now stained with more than just spilled wine. The adrenaline was a familiar, bitter tonic in her throat. She looked at the swinging doors, knowing the carnage in the kitchen was only the beginning. The waitress was dead and buried under the shattered porcelain. Faith Williams leaned over, picked up the hitman's fallen pistol, and checked the chamber with a practiced, icy efficiency. The cleaning crew was coming, but they weren't going to find a victim. They were going to find a ghost who knew how to hunt. Faith stepped back into the lounge, the suppressed pistol tucked into the waistband of her apron, hidden by the curve of her hip. The air in the room had turned from cold to glacial. Hyuk Jang remained standing, his ink-stained hand hovering near his wife's throat, not in a caress, but as a silent promise of what was to come. The Japanese delegates had vanished, likely retreated to the elevators to await the signal for the final sweep. "The kitchen is clear," Faith said, her voice dropping back into a calm, professional cadence that made the wife's eyes dart with renewed terror. Hyuk didn't look away from his wife. "She tried to have you killed, didn't she? Even while sitting at my table." "It was a busy 2 minutes," Faith replied. She pulled a small, silver tablet from the serving station, a device usually used for corkage fees and guest taps. In reality, it was a high-frequency receiver she had modified weeks ago. "Mr. Jang, if your wife has been planning this, she hasn't just signed a paper. She's locked your offshore accounts. Only her voice print and a specific phonetic passkey can reopen the vaults before the ghost dragon cartel drains them." The wife, Seo Yen, let out a jagged, hysterical laugh. "You think you can just beat it out of me? I'll die before I give you a single syllable of those codes. By the time I'm gone, you'll be a beggar in a suit, Hyuk." Faith stepped closer, her eyes locked on the silver tablet. "I don't need you to give them to me. I just need you to speak." "Faith, what are you doing?" Hyuk growled, his patience fraying as the sounds of heavy boots echoed from the hallway outside. "I'm running a baseline," Faith murmured. She looked directly at Seo Yen. "Your suit is a beautiful shade of red, Seo Yen. Is it custom? Tell me the designer. And the material, is it silk or a synthetic blend from the Tokyo district?" Seo Yen sneered, her vanity momentarily overriding her survival instinct. "It's a bespoke Armani, you peasant." Pure Italian silk, ordered through the Ginza branch, account reference 709 Areco. Faith's fingers danced across the tablet. A waveform bloomed on the screen, glowing a vibrant neon blue. "And the merger? You called it a unification earlier. Use the formal term. The one you used in the 2018 Osaka summit. Say it for me." "It was an integrated sovereign asset realignment. You idiot," Xiao Yen hissed, leaning forward, her face contorted with spite. "Does that satisfy your curiosity before we all burn?" Faith tapped the screen one final time. They integrated, and the 709 Areco fragments aligned on the display, a perfect digital jigsaw puzzle. The tablet began to hum, processing the phonemes and the unique vocal fry of the wife's throat. Faith had just tricked her into reciting the very phonetic building blocks required for the encrypted voice key. "Perfect," Faith said, her voice devoid of emotion. She turned the tablet toward Hyuk, showing him a progress bar that was rapidly hitting 100%. "I have her voice, her cadence, and the passkey fragments. I'm building the digital clone now. In 60 seconds, I can authorize the transfer of every yen in the cartel's war chest into a blind trust under your name." Hyuk looked at the tablet, then at the wife, whose face had gone from red with rage to a ghostly, translucent white. She realized too late that her pride had been her undoing. The waitress hadn't asked for the codes, she had stolen the voice that spoke them. 60 seconds, Hyuk repeated, a dark, predatory satisfaction finally dawning in his eyes. "Make it 30. I want to hear the sound of their bank accounts dying while they're still at the door." The sound of heavy boots against the marble outside was no longer a distant echo. It was a rhythmic, metallic thud that vibrated through the floorboards. The Ghost Dragon cartel was breaching the lower lobby, and the heavy security shutters of the lounge were beginning to whine as they descended, sealing the room into a high-tech tomb. Hyuk Jang stood at the center of the room, his hand finally releasing his wife as he drew a weapon from beneath the table. 6 of his personal bodyguards moved into a defensive semicircle, their faces masks of stone, their rifles leveled at the reinforced doors. Where Boxton, boss, the head of the detail, barked, his eyes fixed on the security monitors. "The elevator is dead. The service stairs are crawling with them. We hold here until the backup arrives." Faith Williams didn't look at the doors. She looked at the men. Her Interpol training had taught her that in a siege, the greatest threat isn't the army outside, but the one person inside whose heartbeat is slightly out of sync. As a tactical linguist, she didn't just listen to words, she listened to the cognitive load behind them. "Mr. Jang, tell them the evacuation protocol has changed," Faith said, her voice cutting through the tension with a clinical, icy calm. "Ask them where the secondary extraction point is. Now." Hyuk glanced at her, then barked the command to the line of men. One by one, the guards responded with standard tactical jargon, Sublevel 4, the helipad stairwell, the service tunnel. The responses were rapid, clipped, and perfectly rehearsed. But Faith's ears picked up the microscopic fracture in the fifth man's voice. Park, a veteran who had been with Hyuk for 5 years, hadn't stuttered, but his grammar had shifted into the passive voice. He didn't say, "I will hold the tunnel," he said, "the tunnel will be held." It was a subtle linguistic distancing, a psychological trick the brain plays when it is no longer committed to the action it is describing. "Guard 5, Faith said, her eyes locking onto Parks. "Why did you use the past tense for the extraction codes? The protocols are updated every hour. Unless you've already used them to let someone in." The air in the room spiked. Park's grip on his rifle tightened, a telltale sign of a spike in cortisol. "I don't know what the waitress is talking about, boss. She's trying to divide us." A guilty mind struggles with complex syntax, Faith countered. stepping toward him, completely unafraid of the barrel of his gun. "You're over-explaining. You're using formal honorifics you never use with Mr. Jang. You're trying to create a distance between yourself and the man you're about to kill." Hyuk didn't need to hear more. He saw the way Park's eyes flickered toward the wife in her red suit, a momentary lapse of discipline, a silent confirmation of a shared secret. Before Park could swing his rifle toward the center of the room, Hyuk's weapon barked twice. The traitor slumped against the mahogany wall, his finger twitching on a remote detonator that fell from his pocket. He had been waiting to drop the shutters for the invaders, not to keep them out. "They're already in the vents," Faith said, picking up the fallen detonator and tossing it to Hyuk. "We have 30 seconds before the ceiling becomes the front line." The wife wasn't the only one who sold you out, but she was the only one who didn't know how to hide her grammar. The whine of the security shutters reached a mechanical climax, locking into the floor with a final, heavy thud that signaled their isolation. Outside, the screech of tires and the slamming of armored van doors cut through the muffled Seoul night. Hyuk Jang stood amidst the wreckage of his trust, the dark ink still staining his hand as he looked at the woman he had called his wife. The red suit, once a symbol of her status and his pride, now looked like a warning flare in the dim light of the siege. Seo Yen didn't flinch at the sound of the cartel's arrival. In fact, as the first rhythmic thuds of a battering ram began to shake the reinforced lobby doors below, her posture underwent a chilling transformation. The frantic, wide-eyed panic of the wronged wife vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp arrogance. She smoothed the lapels of her crimson jacket and walked toward the window, looking out at the flashing lights of the rival syndicate's tactical vehicles as if she were greeting guests at a gala. "You were always so obsessed with your crown, Hyuk," she said, her voice devoid of the melodic warmth that had deceived him for years. "But you never realized that a crown is just a target. You're a relic. You lead with blood and honor, while the Ghost Dragon cartel leads with efficiency and math. They didn't buy me, Hyuk. They offered me a seat at a table where the men aren't blinded by their own shadows." Hyuk stepped toward her, his weapon lowered, but his presence more lethal than ever. "You sold out your own house for a seat? You think they'll keep you once I'm gone?" Seo Yen turned, a jagged smile cutting across her face. "I didn't sell out the house. I remodeled it. By dawn, your assets will be liquidated, your lieutenants will be restructured, and the only memory of the great Hyuk Jang will be the ink on a contract you were too stupid to read. It wasn't just a merger, you fool. It was a funeral." Faith stood by the server station, her eyes flicking between the tablet and the door. She could hear the tactical chatter through the vents. The cartel was moving faster than anticipated. "The secondary breach is coming through the north wall," Faith interrupted, her tone flat and tactical. "They aren't here to negotiate your surrender, Seo Yen. They're here to sanitize the room. Including you." Seo Yen laughed, a sharp, brittle sound. "I have a contract. I am their partner." In the world of the Ghost Dragons, there are no partners, only liabilities, Faith countered, her fingers flying across the screen as she monitored the cartel's encrypted comms. "They just authorized Project Zero. That's not a rescue mission. It's an erasure. Your partners are about to blow this floor to keep the assets clean." The first explosion rocked the building, a dull roar that sent a shower of dust from the ceiling. Seo Yan's smile faltered for the first time, her gaze shifting to the door as the sound of splintering wood and rapid gunfire erupted from the hallway. The red suit didn't look like power anymore, it looked like a target. She looked at Hyuk, then at the waitress who had unraveled her masterpiece in a single night. The vans weren't there to pick her up, they were there to bury the evidence. The first breach came not from the doors, but from the ceiling. Shattered glass rained down like jagged diamonds as the cartel's tactical units rappelled through the skylight, their submachine guns coughing suppressed fire into the mahogany-paneled room. Hyuk's remaining guards returned fire, the air instantly thickening with the smell of cordite and the deafening rhythm of a localized war. At the center of the storm, Hyuk Jang flipped the heavy oak table, creating a barricade of splintered wood and ink-stained linen. Faith didn't reach for a gun. She stayed low, her back pressed against the serving station, her eyes fixed on the silver tablet. The screen was a chaotic dance of scrolling code and authentication bars. To anyone else, the noise of the gunfight would have been a distraction. To Faith, it was a countdown. "I'm in the Ghost Dragon's primary server," Faith shouted over a burst of gunfire that shredded a nearby wine rack. They've linked their tactical payroll and logistics to the same master vault Seo Yen was using. If I pull the plug on one, the whole syndicate bleeds dry. Seo Yen lay curled in a ball behind a velvet armchair, her red suit now dusty and torn. Her eyes were fixed on the tablet with a look of pure, unadulterated horror. She knew exactly what was happening. She had spent months building the bridge for the cartel to cross, and now Faith was setting the bridge on fire while they were still standing on it. Faith's fingers blurred across the glass. She activated the digital voice clone she had crafted from Seo Yan's vanity. On the screen, a synthesized waveform of the wife's voice began to speak, not words, but a series of complex, phonetic override codes that Faith had extracted during their baseline conversation. Authorization confirmed, a cold, computerized voice emanated from the tablet. "Now," Faith whispered. She executed a global zero-out command. In the digital ether, millions of dollars began to vanish. It was a silent massacre. Offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, hidden crypto wallets in Zurich, and the primary laundering hubs in Macau were systematically drained. The funds didn't just disappear. They were rerouted into a series of untraceable blind trusts and humanitarian foundations that would take decades to untangle. The effect on the ground was instantaneous. In the hallway, the tactical chatter over the cartel's radios changed from aggressive commands to panicked confusion. Their encrypted comms were suddenly flooded with automated alerts. Accounts closed. Payment failed. Contract terminated. The mercenaries in the room stopped firing. They weren't fighting for honor or a crown. They were fighting for a paycheck that had just ceased to exist. When the money vanished, so did their loyalty. One by one, the red laser dots dancing on the walls disappeared as the tactical units realized they were now working for a bankrupt ghost. Faith looked at Hyuk and gave a single, sharp nod. The war was over before the first clip was even empty. Hyuk stood up slowly, stepping over the ruined contract and the shattered glass. He looked at the men in the rafters, then at his wife, who looked smaller than she ever had. He hadn't fired a single shot to win his empire back, but the silence in the room was louder than any explosion. Faith closed the tablet and stood, the waitress gone for good, leaving only the architect of the cartel's ruin in her place. The Tokyo skyline glittered like a sea of fallen stars outside the floor-to-ceiling windows of the private executive suite. 6 months had passed since the night the ink ran like blood in a Seoul penthouse, but the air in this room felt different, heavy not with the scent of an impending ambush, but with the quiet, absolute weight of undisputed power. Hyuk Jang sat at the head of a heavy obsidian table, his black shirt crisp, his posture relaxed for the first time in years. He wasn't looking at the city, he was watching the woman sitting across from him. Faith Williams had long since traded her white service apron for a charcoal gray tailored suit that fit her like armor. The athletic discipline she had once used to survive a kitchen assassination was now channeled into the steady, predatory focus she maintained as she reviewed the final terms of a global shipping merger. To the rest of the world, Faith was a strategic consultant, a brilliant mind that had appeared out of the shadows to stabilize Hyuk's empire. In reality, she was the master architect. She had spent the last half-year systematically dismantling the Ghost Dragon cartel's remaining cells, using her linguistic expertise to turn their own lieutenants against one another until there was nothing left but dust. As they finalized the last of the paperwork, Hyuk poured 2 glasses of vintage red wine, the deep crimson liquid a silent reminder of the red suit that had once occupied the chair beside him. He handed one to Faith, his dark eyes shining with a deep, earned pride. They didn't need to say a word to understand one another. The enemies of their past were buried, and the woman who had tried to sell them out was now a ghost in a cartel debt prison, paying a price that money couldn't settle. Faith leaned back in her leather chair, taking a slow, deliberate sip. She was no longer a ghost hiding from the world or a waitress waiting for the next disaster. She was exactly where she belonged. The most dangerous piece on the board is never the king. It is the pawn that everyone stopped paying attention to until it reached the other side. True power doesn't always roar or wear a crown. Sometimes, it is the person who hears what isn't being said. As the new duo looked out over their growing empire, the silence in the room was finally perfect. The waitress was gone, the architect had arrived, and the game was finally hers to command.